Before the Civil War, the federal government knew something it was never supposed to know. It knew your name, your address, and roughly how often you sent a letter to someone in another state. This wasn't because of a census or a tax roll. It was because of the mail. Between the 1830s and 1869, the United States Post Office maintained a system of postmaster account books so precise and geographically granular that historians describe them as the most accurate population record of the 19th century. They were more accurate than the decennial census, more detailed than church registers, and more useful to economists than anything the federal government officially claimed to be tracking at the time. Then, in the window between 1869 and 1872, almost all of them vanished. What those records contained, why they disappeared, and who was better off for their absence is a story that revisionist economic historians have been quietly assembling for decades. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what the post office actually was. Most people today think of the 19th century post office as a quaint relic, riders on horseback and handwritten letters sealed with wax. That image is almost entirely wrong. By 1840, the United States had more post offices than any country on Earth, more than Britain, France, and the entire German Confederation combined. There were over 13,000 post offices scattered from coastal cities to frontier settlements. At its peak before the Civil War, the post office employed more federal workers than the military. Because every postmaster submitted quarterly accounts to Washington, the government accumulated a running record of economic activity in nearly every community. These weren't just delivery logs. Postmasters recorded the volume of letters, the value of postage, the names of individuals holding uncollected mail, and those paying overdue fees. In rural areas where banks were sparse, postmaster records were often the only written documents tracking financial relationships. For historians, these records are irreplaceable. They show who was trading with whom, which towns were commercially active, and migration patterns through mail forwarding. They reveal the rise and fall of small enterprises and show merchants managing complex supply chains entirely through personal correspondence years before the telegraph. They were a living map of the American economy. So, where did they go? The answer begins in 1869, when Ulysses S. Grant appointed John Creswell as Postmaster General. Creswell was a serious reformer, interested in making the post office more efficient and less corrupt. The system had accumulated decades of bureaucratic dead weight, and accounting practices varied wildly. Creswell launched a comprehensive administrative reorganization. Old account books were reviewed, consolidated, and, in cases where they were deemed redundant, disposed of. The internal correspondence says they were cleared from the active files. The reorganization was also tied to a physical reality: overcrowding. The post office in Washington had been operating in cramped facilities. When the department moved into new quarters in 1869, decisions about what stayed behind were made quickly by mid-level administrators. The records of the dead letter office alone occupied more physical space than the entire personnel file of the U.S. Army. Researchers at the National Archives report a gap in the postal records collections that is difficult to explain through ordinary attrition. Routine documents from the 1870s onward survive, and scattered fragments from the 1840s exist, but the decades in between, the period of most intensive economic expansion, are represented by a collection so thin it is flagged as anomalous. This is where the revisionist argument gets uncomfortable for the standard telling of American economic history. The standard narrative says the post-Civil War period was a time of creative destruction where railroads unified the market and small local economies were absorbed into national systems. The records that survived were kept by the winners, the railroad companies, large commercial banks, and industrial firms. What the postal records would have shown is the economy that existed before that consolidation. The fragments that do survive suggest it looked very different. Economic historian David Henkin found evidence of a far more distributed commercial landscape. He found small-scale producers corresponding directly with buyers in distant cities without intermediary merchants, and cooperative credit arrangements managed through personal trust networks outside the formal banking system. This was not a primitive economy waiting to be modernized. It was a functional, adaptive ecosystem. The railroad and banking consolidation of the Gilded Age did not simply improve upon it. In many respects, it dismantled it. The people who benefited most from that dismantling had strong reasons to prefer that the earlier system leave as few records as possible. A comprehensive postal archive would have made visible the scale of displacement that accompanied industrialization. It would have documented the commercial relationships that were severed and local credit networks that collapsed. It would have created an evidentiary baseline against which the Gilded Age could have been measured and found wanting. This is not a claim that someone ordered the records burned. The evidence does not support a conspiracy. Instead, it suggests a culture of administrative indifference towards records that memorialized a pre-industrial economy. The people making decisions were political appointees in a government that was making enormous grants to railroad companies and restructuring the national banking system. They simply did not value the old records. In a bureaucracy with limited storage and instructions to modernize, things that are not valued get cleared. The result is a hole in the historical record that shapes every attempt to understand American development. When economists model 19th-century growth, they work from the records that survived. When policymakers invoke the American past, they are invoking a past documented almost entirely by the institutions that replaced the one that was lost. The fragments that remain are revealing in proportion to their scarcity. A collection from western Pennsylvania discovered in the 1970s showed commercial networks 3 to 4 times more active than standard histories assumed. Small iron producers were bypassing major commercial agents, whose records are the ones that typically survive. Another collection from southern Ohio showed cooperative purchasing arrangements, groups of small farmers pooling correspondence to negotiate bulk pricing. This was collective bargaining operating quietly in the 1840s, leaving almost no trace except in these records books. These records also suggest local postmasters acted as micro-financial institutions, extending credit where no banks existed. This was likely standard practice across hundreds of districts, but we can only confirm it where records accidentally survived. What does it mean to lose the record of an economy? It means the economy you can document becomes the economy that is treated as normal: the railroad, the bank, the corporation. The distributed economy built on local credit and direct relationships becomes a kind of myth in the absence of its records. This is the real cost of what happened between 1869 and 1872. It wasn't just the loss of names and dates, it was the loss of an evidentiary foundation for an alternative account of how the American economy worked. The post office knew every name, every route, and every rhythm of a commercial world that no longer exists. Then the records disappeared with the ordinary bureaucratic indifference of an institution that had already decided what it was building next. If those records had been systematically preserved, like railroad ledgers or bank records, what would our understanding of American capitalism look like today? What arrangements that we treat as inevitable would turn out to be choices? We cannot answer those questions with the record we have, and that is precisely the point. The knowledge is gone, and the history we tell is shaped by that absence.